Hello everyone, the Jaha. Let's go on with our history of the People's Republic of China, that is the republic founded after the Communist Revolution of 1949. In the third episode of this series, we talked about the Korean War and how China positioned itself on the international stage during the Cold War, influenced by a very strong ideological opposition with the United States, but also by an increasingly sharp divergence with the USSR. In this fourth episode, we will discuss how China sought to distance itself from its somehow subordinate relationship with the Soviet Union after emulating its 5 year plans model, proposing its own path to communism, which involved the formation of people's communes and a great leap forward and the disastrous consequences that followed. Let's begin. As we have said, the Korean War ended in 1953 with a substantial draw between North and South, who found themselves, after the 3 years of fighting, exactly where they had started, namely along the 38th parallel. This draw, however, is perceived as a real victory by China, because the country, as we said, has joined the war less than a year after the completion of its own revolution, and to do so, it has clashed on the field as equals, practically, with the army of the American giant, that is, with its most bitter enemy, the capitalist and imperialist one we described in the previous episode. In domestic policy, as we also discussed in the second episode, the People's Republic takes the Soviet economic planning of the 5 year plans as an example and sees heavy industry as the driving force of economic development. For this reason, the largest investments of this period are concentrated, as summarized in this poster, in power plants, mining and quarrying, and infrastructure projects in general, but also, as this other poster says, in the steel industry, which is the basis of all the others. And we see them represented here: naval and railway, machinery, warfare, and the mechanization of agriculture, of course. Indeed, agriculture remains the foundation of society. And this other poster, which states the important meaning of the development of agricultural production for the construction of the nation, illustrates and lists the provision of goods and materials for the development of rural communities, which are provided every month or every week with a certain amount of meat, eggs, and beans, as well as steel, fertilizer, and barrels of gasoline. It is indeed the planned economy. Not only do the people's bodies need to be nourished, though, but their souls too. Thus, this other poster illustrates the theoretical and technical training of local participators, that is, those tasked with continuing and igniting the revolution even in the most remote areas of the country, and there are many of them, of course, in China, educating the masses in the values of socialism to, as the poster puts it, raise the cultural level of the people so that they are ready to devote themselves entirely to the cause, to the construction of the new China. As this last poster states in this regard, the people of the whole nation should work together with one mind to struggle to realize the basic tasks of the first 5 year plan. And here we see represented once again the three central strata of society: workers, peasants, and soldiers, but also people of various Chinese ethnicities whom we can recognize primarily by their varied clothing. To summarize, this poster reports growth in total industrial output value and output of major products within 5 years, listing the increase in production of steel, trucks, fertilizer, and other products that I cannot really recognize even by zooming in on the image, sorry. But beyond that, the first 5 year plan marks the transition from the transitional phase following the revolution to the establishment of a truly socialist economy centered on the centrally planned industrialization of the country. The 5 year period ends with significant successes in the development of heavy industry, where, thanks in part to the aid of the Soviet Union, many large industrial plants and numerous infrastructure facilities are built, and specialized and qualified workers in new production processes are trained. The country's gross domestic product, summarized in this last graph, which I created using data from the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics, also grows at impressive rates from 4 to 20% every single year. In short, even excluding dependence on the Soviet Union, which however will not last much longer, and the regional imbalances between urban and rural areas, which instead persist to this day, this is a total success. A success which, combined with The one of the Korean War, at least a perceived one, brings the leadership to believe that the country's conditions are now ripe for a new step forward, for a new leap. It is worth mentioning here that, as many of the documents quoted in the book I'm going to suggest later prove, not the whole leadership agrees to this new leap now. But this is the time when Mao Zedong's personal power is at its peak, and few dare challenge him. And those who will, those who do, will pay for it, as we will see in the next episode when we will discuss the Cultural Revolution. Anyway, Mao Zedong believes the conditions are ripe, we were saying, and so the Communist Party launches a new political economic campaign called Daiyuejin, or the Great Leap Forward. We see it promoted here by this poster that reads, "Strike the battle drum of the Great Leap Forward ever louder." This campaign engages all productive strata of society in a leap of economic, social, and political development, from a socialist to a communist society. That is, from a society where ownership of the means of production is collective and resources are distributed based on work, to a society without social classes or private property, where resources are distributed based on need. In short, as this other poster puts it, communism is a paradise. People's communes are the bridge to get there. But let's get back to the Great Leap Forward. We will talk about the people's communes in a moment. The Great Leap Forward has a practical and a measurable goal: to surpass the United Kingdom in steel production. More precisely, to surpass the United Kingdom in 5 years and the United States in 15. Why steel? Well, because this material is the symbol of heavy industry, which, as we mentioned earlier, is seen as the driving force behind the country's economic development and the foundation of all other industries. Why the United Kingdom? Well, this should be quite obvious because, in addition to be a major steel producer, the United Kingdom is the Western power that, with the invasion of Canton, has ushered in the century of national humiliation that we talk about in the first video of the series. This campaign also has two, so to speak, secondary objectives. The first one would be to demonstrate to the Soviet Union the effectiveness of the Chinese model at a time when, as we have said, relations began to deteriorate after Stalin's death in 1953. The second secondary objective is to reinvigorate the revolution nearly 9 years after its completion, so that the people continue to feel inspired and carried away by it, and thus to devote their full enthusiasm and energy to achieving its goals. In short, as this poster puts it, brave the wind and the waves, and let everyone show what they're capable of. It is a call for courage, determination, and overcoming obstacles to advance, and it is addressed to every single person in the country, as each one possesses unique skills and talents that shall be utilized for the greater good. Let's look at some other posters from this era then. This one reads, "People's communes are good. Happiness will last for 10,000 years." After the agrarian reform of 1952, so at the beginning of the first 5 year plan, which took land ownership away from the bourgeoisie and handed it over to small farmers, a process of collectivization began. Land was transferred from the hands of individual farmers to groups of farmers, groups that began as cooperatives of a few dozen families and evolved into communes, growing larger and larger until they included thousands of families who together owned and worked the land. This reform was implemented through the instrument of the People's Communes of Production, in Chinese Renmin Gongshi, a type of productive organization that concerns not only agriculture but which certainly reached its peak in the countryside. To give you some more information, here I quote directly from Tombstones by Yang Jisheng, a book that I will list in the description and recommend to you later. According to the writer, people's communes flourished particularly between the winter of 1957 and the spring of 1958, so as to group together tens of millions of people and employing them in a massive campaign to build hydraulic works in cultivated fields. Later on, to give you an idea of the scope, the speed, and the enthusiasm they brought, consider the following. On August 29, 1958, the Central Committee of the Communist Party approved a decision concerning the question of establishing people's communes in the countryside, emphasizing how these would guide the peasants in the early construction of socialism and the gradual transition to communism. One only month later, on September 29, 23,384 people's communes had already been formed, comprising 90.4% peasant families. Another month later, at the end of October, people's communes numbered 26,576 and included 99.1% of families. People's communes are both an economic and political body, with the power to control construction, finance, trade, civil administration, education, healthcare, and more. Many of these provide housing and food for their members, medical visits, as well as wedding and funeral services, and even a barber shop, cinema, or leisure activities. People's communes, again quoting from Yang Jisheng's book, aim to replace the family itself. According to Chairman Mao, the organization of families wastes labor and resources. I'm quoting here. Each family takes care of the household chores, cooking, washing clothes, raising children. With the transition to a communist society, it is necessary to free women from housework. And if the people's communes take care of these needs, entrusting, for example, 40 people with the task of cooking, which was previously divided among 200 people, one per family, then the other 160 people are free and can work outside the home and contribute to the prosperity of the commune. Let's look at another poster now. This one reads, more pigs, more fertilizer, higher grain production. Self-sufficiency and productive autarky were imposed at this time by international contingencies. The Cold War on the one hand and the deteriorating relations with the Soviet Union on the other. Being self-sufficient in production, especially in food production, was therefore seen as fundamental, to the point that one of the slogans of this period was "Every pig raised is a cannon shot against American imperialism." The next poster reads, backyard steel furnaces rise in level ground, releasing red rays everywhere, and it introduces perhaps the most iconic symbol of this period, backyard furnaces. First of all, what are backyard furnaces? Well, they are small blast furnaces like those that produce steel, and here we go back to the goal of the Great Leap Forward, right? Like those that produce steel, I was saying, in large factories, but rather than being, so to speak, professional or industrial, they are operated on a much smaller scale in individual people's communes, if not even in the backyard of individual houses. Here we see one no taller than a man. We have already had the occasion to describe how, in the China of these days, we are talking about every political campaign as a disruptive force, depth, and pervasiveness. So, if the party says we need to produce more steel, and its cadres repeat it in every village, convincing the population to put their everything into the enterprise, backyard furnaces multiply everywhere. To feed them, every available metal product is thrown in, starting with pots and pans, because, as we have said, after pulling the land and production, people's communes also pull the kitchens. So it is no longer me who cooks for myself and my family, but the people's commune cooks for everyone, including us. So what is the point of having my own pot at home when the rice and soup are cooked in the people's commune's big pot? Let's throw it into the pot, not the soup, unfortunately. But it is not just a pot, because if the stated steel production target for 1957 is 5 million tons, the following year it has already doubled to 10. And so even production tools, that is hammers, nails, even rakes and shovels, are thrown in a feverish rush to match Great Britain's steel production without paying the slightest attention to the quality of the material produced. Furthermore, causing an environmental disaster by cutting down entire forests to fuel the furnaces and also the kitchens of the communal canteens. And without realizing, drunk as they were with revolutionary fervor, that after having thrown production tools into the furnace, what would be worked with and produced the following year? This is how, in those years, steel production increased just as grain production collapsed. This is summarized in this graph, which shows the average grain production of each province in millions of tons in blue, while steel production is shown in tens of thousands of tons in red. So, what is the result of this mad rush to produce steel? Well, steel production does indeed increase, yes, but it produces an increasingly inferior alloy that ultimately becomes unusable. The numbers are constantly inflated by local particators to make their commune look good, to make it seem more Stakhanovite, more efficient, and therefore more revolutionary. And if Province A inflates its numbers, Province B obviously does the same to keep up. Then again, Province C and D and so on, until those in Beijing who see increasingly exceptional statistics and numbers flowing in are led to believe them and therefore demand even more and more. They raise their targets, see no signs of stopping, and crash at the first turn. All this will come at a very high price in the final years of this movement between 1960 and 1961, when, as we can see, agricultural production collapses, partly because it is eventually realized that the tools of production are no longer available, precisely because they have been thrown away into backyard furnaces. Meanwhile, the steel produced, as we have said, is of terrible quality, but this is only the insult added to the injury, because the worst outcome of the Great Leap Forward will obviously be the humanitarian tragedy, not the economic one, which we can see in the continuation of the GDP trend graph I showed you earlier here. It is a humanitarian tragedy whose numbers are obviously difficult to estimate. However, we are talking about a frightening number ranging from 15 to 50 million deaths from hunger or political persecution during this period. Thus, the last poster in this section, the vegetables are green, the cucumber plump, the yield is abundant, which in 1959 aimed to motivate the peasants, make them feel part of the great revolutionary dream and inspire enthusiasm, by the following year already seemed like another version of the numbers artfully inflated to please the party and hide the truth from the people. And now, with hindsight, with the studies and statistics compiled since, which speak of the production collapse I showed you between 1959 and 1961, first by 12%, then by 26%, and finally by 24% drop year over year. These words on this poster can only serve as an epigraph to those stats. The Great Leap Forward experience ended in 1961. The people's communes began to shrink again, leaving a portion of land and commercial enterprise to individual families, and the communes' kitchens, which were now opposed by the peasants, were then closed. As I said, I'd like to offer another book recommendation by former Xinhua journalist Yan Jisheng. It is called Tombstones and was written in 2008 about the Great Famine that followed the Great Leap Forward. It is not a novel, obviously, but a very detailed and in-depth journalistic investigation that quotes documents Yang had access to precisely because of his role as a regime journalist, as we might say, since Xinhua is China's official news agency. This allowed him to recount the evolution of the situation step by step, from the internal party debate to the victory of Mao's line to the implementation of the Great Leap Forward, the lies, the mistakes, and the disastrous outcomes in four provinces that the journalist examines. And he does so, as he says in his moving introduction to the book, to erect a memorial stone, a memorial tombstone for his father, who died of starvation in 1959, one for the 36 million Chinese who died with him. This is the estimate he arrives to with his sources. Another for the system that generated the Great Famine, and the last one for myself, to testify that I sacrificed my life to uphold my ideas. That's what he says. It's not an easy reading by any means, but I believe it is necessary. Here I stop for today. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to this channel so you'll be first to know when the next one is out. And if you loved it, buy me a coffee through the link down here. In the next episode, we will talk about the Cultural Revolution, the political ideological campaign launched by Mao Zedong in 1966 to reassert his control over the Communist Party and purify society and the party itself of elements considered bourgeois and counter-revolutionary. We'll talk about the Little Red Book with the quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong and the Red Guards, the persecution of intellectuals and officials in a period, another one unfortunately, marked by violence, unrest, repression, and the destruction of cultural heritage, with grave economic and human consequences too. In short, this too is a difficult chapter, but a necessary one. Until then, 再见.